At this point, we would like to ask our speakers and discussants to please join us on the chairs up front so that we can engage in Q&A with our audience, which will be moderated by Tsitsi Makombe, who's a Senior Program Manager here at IFPRI.
Thank you very much, Katala, and thank you so much to all our speakers and discussants. So yes, we're going to open the floor now for questions and comments from both the audience that's here in the room and also that is online. We'll take 3 to 4 questions at a time, and then I'll ask our speakers to respond, and then hopefully we can do another round. So with that, I would like to ask that you briefly state your name, your institution, and then your question or comment. So we can start taking questions. Yes, sir, please go ahead.
John Brown from the University of Maryland. It seems to me that if you want to improve life... Oh, okay. If you want to improve the rural life in East Africa, you have to change the kind of agriculture that's being produced. Maize is a curse with heavy chemical inputs and so forth. It malnourishes because people sustain themselves too much on that, whereas organic, biodiverse permaculture is infinitely better, no hunger season and so forth, which you get with maize. And that also you control the droughts much better with water management policies that make sense. But you have to train the farmers, and that's what's not being done. The training centers are permaculture training centers in Malawi and Kenya and so forth, but they're a drop in the bucket. And I've visited these farms, and I know what they can do by relieving malnourishment, preventing stunting and wasting, and poverty and degradation of the soil. This is the elephant in the room, it seems to me. I've been here several times and other places too, and this is seldom discussed, but what would really contribute to food security and to graduation from poverty would be training of the farmers, because the design of these organic farms is essential.
Yes, Frank, please go ahead.
I'm Frank Place, Director of the Policies, Institutions, and Markets Program at IFPRI. Yeah, I just had a question of whether any of the studies in the book or any of your other knowledge looked at the issue of whether, to what degree, how do governments balance, let's say, covering more people with less transfers, with given budgets and opportunity costs, covering more people with less money in terms of transfers versus targeting a smaller group with higher transfers, and how, what are some of the discussions and discourses around the pros and cons of those different kinds of choices?
Thank you. We'll take maybe 2 more questions. And for those of you who are online, please signal if you have a question, and my colleague here in the room, Lucy, will let me know if we have any online questions. Any other questions in the room?
I have one. This gentleman has a question.
Thank you. My name is Dennis Dufresne. I work with Department of Transportation, and I work with small businesses. So with regarding to the development of rural areas, how much of an infrastructure problem there might be that can alleviate some of those problems? Yes. Because the poverty level is more or less in a very underdeveloped area, so better transportation might alleviate, but I didn't hear anything regarding to that.
All right, thank you. I guess we can sort of tend to the speakers here and have them respond. So we had the first question from the gentleman asking about perhaps we need to look at training programs to help with graduation, and Frank's question in terms of balancing how governments are going about balancing sort of the idea of trying to target more people for social protection versus limited budgets, or maybe having a more sort of a focused program. And the last question about infrastructure. So yeah, I guess anybody's feel free to respond.
I think that they're all very pertinent questions to ask. So I won't dwell on all of them in great detail. But first, on the first question, well, first, I fully agree. So if you need to think of what kind of agriculture and rural development do you need in order to achieve better nutrition, food security, as well as poverty reduction. So for me, and that's also the point I tried to raise, that should be the starting point. And of course, training and extension services could be, and probably in most contexts should be, a critical part of trying to achieve and change things around. And then also within that context, then certain forms of risk management can become a lot more effective. So to give a different example of some work we're doing at the moment at IFPRI, which is on looking at agriculture insurance mechanisms, so weather insurance, and make them affordable both to farmers as well as to insurance companies, something called picture-based insurance, where we now find we look at sort of combinations of interventions where we see is that when you combine sort of the introduction of that kind of insurance with extension services and trainings to adopt for climate smart agricultural practices, that both the adoption becomes more likely, and what we also believe is that then the insurance will be more effective in terms of properly managing risk. Right. So it's one thing is to have an insurance against a bad event that happens. Something else is that you also invest at the same time in reducing the risk for that event. Well, let me jump to the other question on infrastructure and leave the other questions to others to answer. There are quite a few social protection programs that are linked to also to infrastructure works. Right? So in the past, we had emergency employment programs that were linked to investments in infrastructure, and also some of the Cash Plus programs tried to do the same. The thing there is that they're often a more difficult political sell, because whenever you align a cash transfer with an infrastructure investment, the program becomes a lot more costly. So the political sell is more difficult, although the benefits over the long run may be much bigger because you overcome a major bottleneck. So I think it's not so difficult to maybe this audience to sell this, but politically to sell a program that has to be designed or is presented as a social protection program that's so costly, but in fact does a lot more than just social protection, then it's much better to present it in a different way.
Can I add one thing before, just that it's linked to? Sure. Sorry, just to add one thing is, of course, training is important. I will say that first, I will have to look at what are the barriers to diversification, what is the barriers of adopting new technologies. And particularly when we're talking about the extreme poor, these are economic barriers, but also risk management and risk-taking barriers. And we've been trying to review what is the role of social protection programs in addressing those two kinds of barriers. So we just did 2 studies in Malawi and Zambia looking at that and how a public work programs as well as a cash transfer program was useful to change and to help small farmers in thinking about changing to something that is more productive but also more sustainable. So training, it's important, but I always think about the adoption barriers part as a also a first step around that.
Very good. Thank you. I'll probably be touching on a couple of the questions. The one on training and education, and the one on covering a lot with thin layers of resources or doing more. If you're looking at the average African country, which large-scale, non-acceptable level of poverty and budget constraints, it's very difficult to look at social protection as something which is some way within government as a component, standalone or a little bit coordinated. I think to go back to the issue of graduation, short term is probably more of a distraction. The approach ought to be looking at the entire portfolio of resources available to government and see how you can bring together the need to alleviate the impact of poverty in the short run with the longer term goals of productive enhancements or productivity growth. To link it to the example of, for example, education, the budget of the Minister of Education, of Health, of Agriculture, and Infrastructure should be looked at as one bundle in terms of addressing the issue of short-term vulnerability and long-term productivity. So the way I would bring education in there is that we talked about Cash Plus. If I'm providing social protection in rural areas, I will bring in the Minister of Education so that vocational and professional training is part of the package. It could be made conditional to having that kind of training. So then suddenly agriculture, education, and social protection both contribute to the same goals. I will do the same thing in terms of resources. I would not look at what I have for social protection. I will bring health to contribute. Looking at the youth, for example, vocational training will be a very important thing, but also for health in the rural areas. Youth will be the biggest beneficiary of that. We did work here several years back looking at how social services could enhance productivity of agricultural inputs and technologies, actually, in the short run. We know in the long run it happens, right? In health, our beginning hypothesis was that not all health services affect all diseases the same way. And disease prevalence affects labor productivity in different ways, depending on what kind of disease you have, right? So by playing around the kind of services you provide and the diseases you're targeting, i.e. preventive services targeting seasonal labor, seasonal diseases that curtail labor productivity in the rural areas, gives you a big return in terms of productivity compared to just health services in general. So there you have the opportunity to work with the health ministry, education, and other ministries to do it. That is the only way to get to scale and much faster in addressing poverty and in dealing with social protection.
Thank you, Usman. I know Ash also wanted to comment on that second question.
Yeah, just a couple of quick points on the issue of this trade-off between coverage and transfer size. That's a really very real issue that we deal with in many of the countries that the transfer project works in. It's very much linked also to the governance structure. So, in Zambia, the prior election, the incumbent ran on a social protection platform and promised the scale up of the SCT, the social cash transfer. So there was obviously very big sort of incentives there to widen coverage at the same sort of transfer level, even as we were working with the ministry to articulate that you need a certain level of transfer to have an impact. But there, the issue was the coverage, right? In Kenya, the last election, again, Uhuru Kenyatta ran on this platform where he was going to roll out this universal child grant, right? So, and in Ghana as well, it was tied to the election. So in those situations, yes, very much so. Now, is that good or bad? I have some colleagues who say, Ashu, what do you stop your complaining about the transfer size. Just get as many people covered, and then the program can never go away. Then you work on the transfer size, right? So it's kind of an interesting dinner time conversation for sure, but it's very real, and it depends a little bit on the circumstance under which these programs are scaling up, right? Just a quick point on the infrastructure. In some of the work that the FAO and we've done to show that there are these heterogeneous impacts of the cash transfer. In other words, the cash has bigger impacts when you're closer to a market, when you're closer to a road, right? And so I don't necessarily see that you have to align the two kind of programs or right, but we do know that if you have the other things in place, then the cash does have a bigger impact, right? And I think that's part of just the general development policy.
Thank you, Ashu. Yes, I think we can turn to our online audience. So, Lucy, go ahead and let us know who has a question.
Thank you. So we have questions from 2 online viewers. The first is Umar from FAO Senegal, working on the Food Security and Nutrition Governance Project. How can agriculture insurance be used as a social protection tool in boosting growth in Africa? And how possible is it to mainstream accountability for better transparency in some tools like cash transfer or food for work? The second is from Whitney from the Center for Agriculture and Food Systems at Vermont Law School. Do participants face stigma for utilizing these programs? If so, are these policies in place to destigmatize these programs?
Thank you. We can take maybe one or two other questions from the room. Any questions? Yes, please go ahead.
I appreciated Ashu's sort of emphasis of the importance of linking the youth bulge or the demographic dividend to these PSMP or to these safety net programs. And I just got back from a month of looking at this a little bit in Ethiopia. And to be honest, so I work at Food for Peace. I'm in the gender and youth team there. And this question comes up so often about how can we actually program for youth livelihoods in areas where there aren't markets, where there isn't education, where maybe you do have linkages to TVET systems, but that doesn't actually lead to any kind of outcome change in youth's lives. So I would love to ask the panel if they have any examples of where that kind of linkage has been productive. I want all of the studies that you can give me on that. That would make my life and my job easier. So thanks so much.
Thank you very much. We can take one more question before turning back to the speakers. There's a lady next to you, John, on the side.
Hi, my name's Laura. I also work at Food for Peace in USAID. And I'm thinking about like climate change and climate shocks, and how can these social protection programs be shock responsive? How can countries use them to help manage shocks? That's the end of the question.
Okay, thank you very much. Yes, so we have, I think, up to 4 questions. I know there was one directed at Ashu specifically. So I'll turn it to you, speakers. I don't know if any of you want to respond to, or maybe we can start with Ashu since there was a question directed at him, then we'll turn to others. But you can answer the other ones, whichever ones you want to answer. Yes.
I can't. How do we program for youth? That's what we're all wondering, actually. And maybe Natalia has. We had a transfer project retreat a few months ago. Then we had our workshop where she won the fastest speaker award. And really, that is the big agenda right now: is how do we program for youth? I mean, I don't have an answer to that. There are a couple of interesting pilots going on. One in Tanzania that I'm aware of with UNICEF. But that is, I think, the issue because of the demographic transition. Programming for shocks, I would say what many countries have done is they're trying to build systems where they can roll out, where they can either top up the cash transfer. That was done in Ghana, done in Malawi, right? So you have existing beneficiaries, a shock in a particular region, you give them an extra transfer too, right? So building a system that allows you to be shock responsive. But that entails, of course, having already sufficient coverage, right? But that's a really interesting, exciting area. The stigma thing, no, I haven't really come across that. I don't think it's not the same as the U.S. So.
Sorry, just to come in a little bit on the stigmatization. So I can only really comment on the chapters that were in the ATOR, but there was a really nice chapter on Egypt, on the strategy, what do you call it? The social protection program, the big one that IFPRI is evaluating. And there was this study by Sikandra Kurdi who actually looked at how did kind of those were targeted, how were they considered, and how did people think it was fair that they were being targeted. So I guess usually you'd say you look at kind of, you try to do a kind of an income test, right? You try to find out how much is the household earning and does the household qualify for the support. But because that's so difficult to do and requires a lot of kind of collection of information, I think what they did in Egypt was they tried to see kind of an asset kind of composition of the household. So what did the household own and what type of income sources did it kind of have, and did that then, on the basis of that, did they qualify? So it was very easy for households then to see who got the transfer. So everybody kind of knew who got the transfer, and everybody kind of knew who was actually the household that had the car parked outside and still got the transfer. So there was a lot of discussion actually that some households say, well, I don't know why this household actually received the transfer because clearly they're non-poor. So there was this really the sentiment of kind of people looking at why somebody received the transfer and whether that was fair or not. And there was this whole discussion about it. So that was kind of, I think it's a really interesting chapter to come back to, because you're dealing with small communities and people notice stuff, and there is kind of, you know, this whole kind of discourse around what's going on. And then I wanted to say one other thing, which was, what were we doing? So yeah, this program for shock. So there's one other interesting study that I didn't get to talk about in the ATO, which talks about conflict settings. So kind of how can social protection affect households that are actually affected by conflict. And I think that's kind of nice to look at. I think they did an experiment in Mali. This is Gali, I think, and Tranchant. Is it good? Well, anyway. And so, I mean, I think that gives you an idea of kind of how households can be supported in time of a conflict, essentially as a shock. And so that gives you an interesting insight on what social protection can do. And it actually found that if households were receiving some type of social protection support, they were better able to kind of navigate the shock that emanates from this type of conflict.
A quick comment on how to plan for youth, right? Social protection, especially for youth, ought to be looking at making them more productive because they are in that stage of life where they have all the potential and all the willingness to work. And that's why I think that, again, the comprehensive approach to social protection, not just entitlement or cash transfer, but how do you get a minimum level of supply of social services in the rural areas to make the rural areas more livable? You don't do it just from the social protection program, but we do it from across the government. Having just a dispensary, a little tiny market, and maybe a meeting hall in most villages will transform those places. If you go to some of those villages, they'll be very proud if they have a new dispensary. That's what they will show you first when you arrive. Then you have to bring in the opportunity for training and for skills development. That again cannot be just a social protection program, but you have from the government bring in the programs that bring those services into rural areas. Then you can use social protection programs to link it to that. Then it will work as well. Same with health. So therefore, that synergistic, convergence-based approach across ministry is going to be important. It had an additional advantage to that. You again are operating in a very tight budget environment. You find ministries fighting for resources, the same dollar. And then every ministry looks at the dollar going to another ministry as lost to them. If you were to have this kind of synergistic approaches, $100 going to health is not $100 lost to agriculture. Because if you got a bridge between the two ministries and 20 out of those 100 going to health are used so that they can be complementary to social protection programs, they are not lost. If they can be complementary to productivity enhancing programs, they are not lost. The same with education. So suddenly you have a bigger bundle of resources available for the rural areas and in a much more synergistic way. That's the only way you really can do it, especially when you're targeting youth, where you're looking for productivity enhancements rather than just social protection. Thanks.
Maybe to addressing two questions. I think that the question of stigma is unfortunately very much linked with all the myths and policy perceptions around particularly cash transfers, that they're handouts, that they're not rights, they're not entitlements. And a lot of the work to address that has been precisely to enhance the information to the people that are participating in these programs, that this is a right, that this is an entitlement, and this is something that they are receiving because of that. So there's a lot of work around that in order to strengthen that perception. And maybe that's linked around the question around accountability. How do we strengthen the capacity of communities, of local actors to serve as the main actors, making sure that what the government is providing is reaching the population it needs to be reached, is delivered in a positive way, etc. And that I think still is a work that is key, that is part of the T element of social protection, the transformative way of changing power dynamics. And I don't think we've put a lot of attention still on that. On climate and social protection, we need a 2-3 hour seminar around that, because I think that is the new, not new, but the key area of interest around that. No, so two things. One, social protection in general, not just cash transfers, but insurance and many others. By by their nature, are being developed to be able to address risk and to be able to help families to enhance their capacity to withstand, address multiple risks, household level, but also climate-related risk. The way that a climate shock can affect assets. If I have a social protection program, I can therefore minimize some of the negative coping strategies that I'm forced to, like selling off my assets, pulling children out of school, etc. So that part I think has been discussed, and it has been very much, for example, the reason why the PSNP was at the end developed. No, having that was the rationale of the government in order to design the program. Was not necessarily poverty reduction, was risk management, given the predictable shocks that the country is usually affected by. But now the question that was, that is in Sendai, that is in the WHS, the World Humanitarian Forum, is we have a lot of programs that are in place. How do we have a better use of these systems to better channel aid after a shock, but most importantly before, particularly when these are predictable and you were able to define different triggers based on information to respond maybe 3 months or before a particular impact happens. And I think that's a big part of the work right now. How do we use early warning information systems? How do we link them with the management information systems of social protection programs, for example? Do we top up only with cash, or do we also top up with other ways to help families to protect their assets? So there's a wealth of information of what does it mean to make it shock responsive. From our side, we also add the risk inform, which I think is also much more critical to see that additional element of social protection programs. Thanks.
Let me follow up on Natalia, because I wanted to address the maybe combine the questions about agriculture insurance and shock-proof insurance or protection mechanisms and climate shocks. I think the way to look at it is ideally you would like to see social protection, not with the name social protection, with social insurance, right? Particularly if you take it from the risk perspective. So you'd like to avoid people falling through the cracks because of an economic crisis, because of a disability or a health crisis, or because of a climate shock. Now, but we have different mechanisms because, well, we may not be able to group all risks under one heading, right? And maybe also too difficult to have insurance mechanism for each and everything. But first thing on agriculture insurance, it's often was seen as something you could not do for poor people because they typically live in areas which everybody faces the same shock. So how you can do a feasible agriculture insurance is like taking an insurance, a hurricane insurance that only covers the population of Florida, right? So that would not work because once the hurricane strikes, then the payouts are for everybody, and the insurance would be depleted, right? So, but what we found, and in our work on agriculture insurance, that actually in practice also for the poor it can be a bankable proposition because also in areas where people seem to be facing the same conditions, the impacts of a drought or a change in rainfall works out quite differently even in the same area. So we do that with checks on picture-based insurance, so that gives more certainty. So you take pictures of the whole cycle of the crop, more certainty that you get a payout because you can prove that you had actually damage to your crop. But it also it makes it interesting for insurance companies because they can see there's much more diversified risk going on. Now, of course, if there's a real big weather shock that does affect everybody, then that no longer works. So then you need other mechanisms to cope with it. But it can be part of a range of tools. So I think that's why I think Fleur was talking about a systems approach. So a system approach means looking across all these instruments and what seems to be working best. I guess that also applies in the same way to climate shocks. I already mentioned weather shocks and so on. But I think there's no cash transfer or that kind of social protection program that can hedge against all those shocks. But what makes a difference, and that I think most of the studies do come up with, if you give people a regular flow of income, when they're poor, right? A small, even if it's a small cash transfer, it gives them some guarantee. If I lose a harvest or I lose my job, I have something to go by, and it will not immediately disinvest in what I have or sell my cows or my other assets that people may have. So it does work that way. So it helps people sail through a crisis in certain ways. Again, if the shock is very big, it will never be enough. So then complementary measures will have to take place. But I would be against benefits that are volatile with the shocks. It's difficult for fiscal reasons, because when the economy goes bad, then the fiscal cost will be relative to earnings will become too high. So that will be difficult from that angle, but also from an entitlement and political economy perspective. Right? Once you raise, because there was a crisis last year, you had raised the benefits, and then the government says, okay, now you get half of what you received last year. Then people say, hey, what's this? Right? So they adjust to that. So it's better to have a more stable income that should be defined against the means that the country can afford, but also that are a meaningful minimum level that avoids the people from falling through the cracks, as I mentioned before. So I think that's the best way to manage that, and it will never be easy, but we should think of it that way.
Thank you very much. Unless there are burning questions remaining, I would like to turn to our speakers for them to give us. Okay, it looks like we do have some burning questions. Okay, let's get them. Rui, go ahead. Yes.
It's just about the issue of sustainability. You know, it was referred in the beginning, but sorry? Yes. No. It was referred in the beginning, but it didn't really discuss much about it. We know that in Latin America, social protection has been known to have contributed significantly for poverty reduction over a period of time, but this issue of sustaining such levels of social protection to kind of consolidate poverty reduction have been at risk. So the question here is, what kinds of lessons do we have from, say, Latin America, for Africa in this case? And the second question is about the redistribution. I mean, in some more countries, the higher level of development, the issue of the fiscal policy has been used to tax the richer to ensure that you can sustain the coverage of the poor over time. So are these kind of issues being also on the table? And also the issue of the universal income, the debate on the universal income, to what extent is it shaping the future of the debate on social protection? Thank you.
Could you quickly introduce yourself? I think you forgot to do that.
My name is Rui Benfica, and I am a senior researcher at the senior research at IFPRI and the PIM program. Yes. Just joined this week.
Yes, thank you, and welcome. Yes, I think we had another question in the back.
Hello, my name is Julie, and I'm also a researcher here at IFPRI. A little bit building on the sustainability of social protection, and somewhat on the comment from the gentleman from University of Maryland, and thinking about soil as a form of social protection, and I was wondering how that kind of factors in. He mentioned a farm in Malawi, and I was thinking about this as an example, and this is, if I'm thinking of the same project that actually was able to closed the nutrition hospital as a result of the diverse productivity of the farms in the area, and so they undermined this, or eradicated, or they highly mitigated this nutrition problem in the area, and so wondering how soil, because it does have this sort of multiplicity of benefits when it comes to flood and drought reduction, food security, as well as reducing pests. How does that factor in, given that it is a very long-term strategy and doesn't have the sort of immediate benefits of maybe instituting an insurance program or a subsidy program, but may something like insurance or subsidies, which may have short-term benefits and actually cause long-term problems, depending on how they're used, if they ultimately disrupt the ecosystems, compromise farmers. Well, I'll just leave it at that. Sorry, I'm going on too long. So.
Okay, I'll give a chance to our speakers here to respond. Usman,
On
you
the
want to go?
sustainability, even in the developed economies, looking at social protection just as an entitlement is an issue for sustainability. You have it everywhere. People just talk about it. Welfare reforms again and again and again. Social protections in Europe again and again. So it's very hard. And it's even harder in a developing economy. As I said, there's no African country that could approach social protection from the entitlement point of view, i.e. generating fiscal resources just for the purposes of redistribution. It's going to be very, very difficult. You basically have to start from the angle of saying that every economic decision that I make as a government, whether it's in health, in education, infrastructure, in trade, whatever it is, will have a differential impact between poor and non-poor people. And I tend to emphasize in all those programs, those components that are much more targeted toward improving the livelihoods of poor people in the shorter run, right? So that you have a bigger budget to start with, which is the entire government budget and the entire departmental budgets, rather than just trying to look for resources. You will have to do that, but that's going to be perhaps the tip of the iceberg. What you have to work with is the entire budget and the programming of your budget. Otherwise, there's no way you can make that sustainable. You just won't have the money, or you're going to task the economy to death. And at the end of the day, you wouldn't be able to help the poor people.
Maybe to follow up on that, and maybe first what lessons to draw from Latin American experience. Well, I think there could be quite a few lessons, but let me focus on one. The first is in line with what Usman was saying, is your social protection schemes have to adjust as you move forward. As you should not hang on to the same kind of program, because eventually you get to a point, okay, how are we going to move forward? So to give one example from a program I know best in Latin America, Ecuador's program, which cash transfer program was developed in the late 90s, evolved subsequently in recent years because before the recent drop in oil prices in oil exporting countries, so they increased tremendously the benefits to a program that's caters for about 50% of households in the country, right? So it's a huge program. And right from the beginning was there. But in the beginning, the benefits were very small. But when oil prices were high, benefits allowed to increase, had a tremendous impact on lowering poverty rates, also impact on reducing inequality. But of course, that proved to be not sustainable. But the main culprit there is that since the eligibility was defined by not having a regular job or basically being in the informal sector. So the program started giving an incentive for people to stay at least with one foot in the informal sector, right? And that's become a culprit of that program to say, well, how can we shift to the next level? And I think what should happen is that if your main driver of the broader social protection is through cash transfer programs, that you should already think through, okay, there comes a time that it's not about graduating out of social protection, it's graduating from one type of social protection to the next. You want to graduate them into at least a social insurance program, so that when there is a real shock, that you have something to go by, right? So you don't fall through the cracks. But it doesn't have to be a cash transfer. It can be something else. It can be a proper insurance mechanism. So you have to think through that. So the system will have to change moving forward. Lastly, on the last point, I think also there the broad point to think about whether soil is important or something else is that social protection have a function to build resilience. It's about that. So soils could be part of that equation if soils are very poor, if it enhances productivity and so on. So it's about what I mentioned before, the coherence across these areas, but with a clear focus. How can we build greater resilience so people on their own can protect themselves against temporary shocks?
Thank you very much. We are almost out of time, but I would like to give Usman an opportunity to give maybe some closing remarks very briefly.
Well, very briefly. Thank you, everybody who came here. We would like you to keep an eye on the RESAC's website and the reports that are coming and the conferences. And on behalf of Katharla and the seminar communications department, to thank you also for your time. We look forward to seeing you at the next policy seminar. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for a lively discussion. And that concludes our policy seminar.